according to our model, there are economic changes every 50 years or so, and that election. And that election will not be this year, even though it looks hellish. It'll be the following year. We see a great deal of stability in the system this year. The kinds of things we compare it to is the 1970s. You had the 82nd Airborne attacking Detroit, putting down snipers. You had tremendous discussions about sex, the question of whether or not you had premarital sex. Believe it or not, that was a major issue, and votes were taken. You had a tremendous problem economically with very high unemployment, very high inflation, tremendous instability in the economy, and the belief after Richard Nixon abandoned the gold standard and freeze all raises in income or prices, a sense that the country was coming to pieces. Very similar to the mood we're having now. And our forecast essentially is that those things are illusional. The country was not coming apart, did not come apart. And we measure this period against the 70s. And we find that by most variables, this is not nearly as bad as the 70s were. We don't have the oil embargo driving prices up. So from an economic point of view, we see traditional American rage and everything else there, but we see a pretty stable outcome. Not a period of growth, but it's not a catastrophe. The United States is formed through immigrants who were not welcomed, but essential. It was formed through a movement westward, engaging Indians and so on. The founders created this country with the intention that nothing could be done by the government. Mm-hmm. They created a presidency that could not function unless Congress was with it, 50 governors, and all these other institutions. The founders were terribly afraid of getting things done. They were terribly afraid of the wisdom of the politicians. So they created a system that would hold together by the citizens. And the citizens were different. And all through our history, the citizens both pulled together and ripped apart. At the transition point, which is coming very soon, the rage between the sectors is great. Everybody hates all politicians. Don't worry about that. That's normal. What is abnormal, but happens frequently, is little kind of social tensions that are building up. Ronald Reagan was the last transitional president we had 50 years ago. He came into a situation where the economy was shattered, where people really were angry at each other. I mean, it was a difficult period. And he was able to deal with it essentially by manipulating the tax system, by making investment capital available, and also by a personality that could look at it and nobody ever thought he'd riot or anything like that. He never attacked anybody viciously or anything like that. He just sat on top of it. So when we look at the various presidents we have, like Roosevelt, who also came into the Great Depression and soothed the country, that was the thing happening. Now, Great Depression, the rage between segments of the population was enormous. I mean, somebody had to be blamed, and it was probably the Catholics, the Jews, blacks, whoever got available. And it was an ethnic problem, and Roosevelt solved it. So what we get in this period is tremendous, and people blaming other people for anything that might possibly be wrong. And a president comes in that does two things. He manipulates the tax code in whatever direction it has to go this time. And he also does not attack his enemies. He refuses to be hostile. So it's not going to be Trump, God knows. It's not going to be Biden. But these are the kind of characteristics you look for in transition. We are not yet at a breaking crisis. Life still goes on. A sense of catastrophe has not yet broken out to most people. But we also haven't really taken the economic crisis to its final point. When Roosevelt got elected, unemployment was extraordinary. The biggest problem in the country was people were hungry, literally, and he had to deal with that. Reagan had to deal with the incredible stress that was created, well, at one point by the Vietnam War, but also the stress that was created by an economy that was malfunctioning. The Japanese are taking over our auto industry. So these are all things. We're not quite there yet. The way we model it is we take a look at every 50 years what it looked like. And there's a pattern. And we're coming into that pattern. And whoever the election of this president is going to be is what I call Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter had the misfortune to be elected as the last president in that cycle. And there was also Herbert Hoover, who was elected as. It's not a pretty good place to be. But in this election, we get our vanilla president. The next president is going to have to face everything we're looking at. So when it gets serious enough, deep enough, then they can get consensus. While it's still not crushing everybody, you have divisions. By the time Reagan came in, everybody knew something was really seriously wrong. And so there was actually consensus about people would line up behind him. When Roosevelt came in, nobody could deny that something was absolutely wrong in the Great Depression. So that's what we're looking for, the situation to get worse. Until then, people have the freedom to be all over the place. Roosevelt was regarded widely as a playboy, unfit for this job, there only because he was a Roosevelt. Reagan was an idiot. Reagan wasn't able to focus on anything. Reagan was just a loser. How did we get him? So the answer was, in both those cases, they understood what they were doing. So they went silent. They just, well, we had the Laffer curve, we fixed, but what they did was not fight back. So unlike Biden, who has to hit back every time somebody comes at him, and other presidents who are very similar to that, Carter, they essentially ran the presidency at the early stages under heavy attack, but not hitting back. Well, the weakness of economic analysis is that it rarely takes into account war. Wars are the normal process of these great powers. Britain was constantly at war. Portugal was at war. Rome was at war. You do not have the position of the United States dominating the two oceans. That's the important thing, without being challenged. And wars can have different economic effects, but as World War II showed, it is a tremendous booster to the economy. We were in a depression. World War II had a huge amount of borrowing, bonds being sold. That borrowing drove the rise of the auto industry, of the suburbs, of everything else. In economics, and this is not universally true, there is not an understanding of the various dimensions of war. And when we sit and talk about great empires in Ukraine or something like this, we have to understand that's the price of empire. If you have an imperial position and the United States dominates both oceans, which is extraordinary, you will be engaged in wars. And those wars have an economic impact. If you lose, they're usually a bad one. If you win, they tend to be stimulating. And that's not always true. It's very complicated. But economists tend to see that as an anomaly, so some oddity from outside. Whereas I look at it as the United States is a great power. It's going to spend a good deal of the time in war and near war circumstances, as in Vietnam or Korea or going forward in Cold War. So the expectation that the war is unneeded, well, it may not be unneeded economically, it is needed militarily, and then militarily it shoots back an economy. We had such a boom after World War II, it was unbelievable.